All right, Susan, whenever you're ready, I can go ahead and take down the slide.
Okay, I just want to say hi to Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Susan. Thanks for
Okay.
hosting me.
Sure, our pleasure, really. Okay, I'm ready. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Shirk. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego, and it's a great pleasure today to host Peter Martin for a book talk about his new book, China's Civilian Army, a wonderful study of China's diplomatic corps and how their role in Chinese foreign policy and how this has changed over the history of the People's Republic of China. It's a very timely topic because everybody's talking now about China's wolf warrior diplomacy and diplomats. And so we're hoping that Peter will let us know, is this a kind of tradition in China or something very new? And help us understand what's going on and what the consequences may be. Peter Martin is someone I have had the good fortune to get to know in China, talking about Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy. He is a political reporter for Bloomberg News, covering China, and he has spent quite a lot of time in China, about 8 years in all, beginning in 2008 and going up until 2020. So he's been able to do a lot of interviewing in China and to be on the ground there to help him write this book. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Peter to tell us about the book. Please, everyone else, feel free to ask questions, submit them in the Q&A box, and I'm going to make sure that Peter stops at least 15 minutes before the end of the hour so we have time for question and answer. So Peter, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Thank you, Susan. You don't know this, but when I first arrived in China as a graduate student in 2008, Fragile Superpower was the first book that I read about Chinese foreign policy. It was kind of my Bible for the first year when I was at Peking University. And I think if you compare the two books, you'll see some kind of fragile superpower themes that run through it. So anyway, I thought I would talk a bit about how I came to write this book, and then kind of move on to some of the arguments and findings. And I think we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So I arrived back in China in 2017 after being away for a few years, and began this role with Bloomberg, writing about Chinese politics and foreign policy. And I was immediately struck by the massive economic and military progress that China had made. And China was launching this Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative across the world. It was rapidly militarizing its artificial islands in the South China Sea. And it seemed to have this huge opportunity as well, with the Trump administration picking fights with allies all over the place and criticizing international institutions. There seemed to be this big opportunity for diplomacy. And yet somehow China didn't seem to be able to take advantage of that. And that was strange, because as we head into this world where US leadership is receding, and we've increasingly got a whole range of powers vying for influence, the ability to persuade others, the ability to do diplomacy successfully is ever more important. So as I started to get curious about that theme, I really came to see Chinese diplomats as kind of a microcosm of China's broader struggle to communicate. So when I interact with them on a personal level, they would often come across as suave and sophisticated, sometimes funny, and they could speak languages, ranging from Czech to Indonesian, and studied at Georgetown, and all kinds of impressive things. And yet when they got up on the podium in the foreign ministry, or when they sat down with their foreign counterparts, they could come across as stilted, ideological, and sometimes even a little bit angry and aggressive. And so I wondered, where does this disjuncture come from? We have such impressive individuals and such a stilted performance, and what are the origins of that? So I started to look at the memoirs of retired foreign ministers, people like Li Jiaxing and other senior officials like Dai Bingguo, and then poked around and looked to see if there were other memoirs like that. And it turned out that there were more than 100 memoirs written by former Chinese diplomats, ranging from senior to junior, and right across the spread of the PRC's history from 1949 onwards. And they're pretty boring books. They're hard work, but they contain these little details which kind of explain, well, what does it feel like to be on the front line of Chinese foreign policy? And when you take enough of them and start to piece them together, you start to get a sense of the incentives that drive Chinese diplomacy, not just on a policy level, but also on a kind of personal and individual level as well. So I decided this would be a good topic for a book. And when I started out about 4 years ago, it was pretty niche and pretty geeky, if I'm honest. But I plowed ahead because I'm a pretty geeky kind of person. And during that time period, suddenly Chinese diplomacy, with what is now called wolf warrior diplomacy, this much more brash and abrasive style, started to be rolled out across the world. And suddenly it went from this niche topic to really quite a mainstream one. And just in the last couple of years, we've had Chinese diplomats storming out of international meetings. We've had diplomats accusing the US of starting the coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan, and others telling foreign leaders to shut up. And so, but what I think you'll find is interesting is if you start to delve into the history of the PRC diplomatic corps, you realize that actually this behavior that we're now calling wolf warrior diplomacy has deep roots, and really stems back to 1949 and even before. So when the PRC was first founded by Mao Zedong in 1949, China basically had no diplomats. There were a small group of foreign affairs officials who had worked with Zhou Enlai, the PRC's first foreign minister and founder, for a long time. But apart from that, there was no established bureaucracy. The small number of nationalist Kuomintang diplomats who had stayed behind were deemed too ideologically impure to use in the new foreign ministry. And so they started from scratch with essentially a ragtag group of peasant revolutionaries. And they faced this kind of paradoxical challenge. So on the one hand, this was a deeply paranoid political regime, which was obsessed with secrecy and worried about the outside world and how foreign powers might undermine its grip on power. And on the other hand, it desperately needed to communicate with that outside world, to win friends and to build influence for itself. And so to square that circle, Zhou Enlai, who I really see as the founding father of Chinese diplomacy, the PRC's first foreign minister, he came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats would act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. They would be unfailingly loyal to the party, they would be disciplined to a fault, and they would project this kind of fighting spirit as they protected China's interests across the world. And so they set up this kind of militaristic martial ethos inside the foreign ministry from the very beginning. And it resulted in a set of really distinctive behaviors, many of which continue directly to this day. So Chinese diplomats will typically stick very closely to talking points, even if they know that those talking points don't resonate with foreign audiences. they'll move in pairs and go for meetings in pairs so that one is there to keep tabs on the other. They will sometimes shout at foreign counterparts if they feel cornered or if they're worried that they might not look tough enough to a home audience. And they'll often elevate even the smallest of incidents into major issues because they worry that they'll be judged as insufficiently loyal to the government. And so this approach led to what we would now call wolf warrior tactics right from the beginning, especially when the political atmosphere in Beijing became tense. So in 1950, Wu Xiuquan, who was this veteran revolutionary leader, the guy had a scar on his face from a bullet mark, and had been a soldier in the PLA and a long-time revolutionary. He led a delegation to New York, to the United Nations, and he delivered a speech which frankly makes today's wolf warriors kind of look like wimps. Time magazine described it as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. And in the 1960s, Chinese diplomats were seen literally wielding axes on the streets of London as they fought with protesters there. So there's been this combative tradition for a long, long time, but sitting beside it has been kind of an alternative tradition in Chinese diplomacy, which is much more geared toward winning friends and building influence. And so in the mid-1950s, China launched this charm offensive across the developing world, most famously with the Bandung Conference in 1955 for African and Asian nations. And at that conference, Zhou Enlai encountered a lot of hostility from people from other leaders in the room. And he actually set aside his pre-prepared remarks and gave an impromptu speech, which was short on ideology and didn't harp on Taiwan in the way that perhaps one might have thought that it would. And that really succeeded in helping to build trust for China and to genuinely win friendship across the developing world. And equally importantly, in the 1990s, China launched an incredibly successful charm offensive in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre, which culminated in its successful hosting of the 2008 Summer Olympics. And so there are kind of these 2 tendencies which have cycled in and out over time. One tendency is to charm the world, and the other is to use wolf warrior tactics to tell it off. And recently we've seen a lurch back toward that kind of combative, assertive tendency. I think it's been driven by 2 things. One is a kind of new confidence that started around 2008 with China's successful handling of the financial crisis, and which saw a couple of years of really very assertive diplomacy, followed by a short reset. And it's become increasingly apparent since Xi Jinping became Communist Party boss in 2012. But paired with that new confidence is a political system which is really an increasingly scary place for officials to work and live. And so under Xi's leadership, China has launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which has punished more than 1.5 million officials. Xi has abolished term limits. He has experimented on a large scale with re-education camps to subdue Xinjiang. And he's focused on ideology, Marxist ideology, and hostility toward the outside world. And so when Chinese diplomats see these kinds of signals in their domestic politics, they know on a very deep level how to interpret them and how to respond to them. Over the decades, the foreign ministry has experienced multiple rounds of purges where colleagues were encouraged to inform on each other. And in the Cultural Revolution, things got so bad that ambassadors were locked in cellars. They were forced to clean toilets, and some of them were beaten so badly that they coughed up blood. And and actually at one point, Chinese diplomats themselves, many of them were sent off to re-education camps. And so they know exactly how high the stakes can be when you get on the wrong side of the leadership in Chinese politics. And I think this confluence of factors, this new assertiveness paired with these enduring insecurities, set the tone for Chinese diplomacy in the last few years. And diplomats began to mimic the way that Xi Jinping spoke about China's place in the world. So he has said publicly, China stands tall in the East. He said that we are experiencing changes unseen in a century in the international system. And he's talked about the obvious advantages of China's political system. And diplomats have responded to this by praising Xi, by talking in that same grandiose way about China's ambitions, and also by handing out copies of his book at public events in a way that strangely mimics the way that Chinese diplomats behaved in the Cultural Revolution. And so I think this new tone really went into high gear after the coronavirus outbreak. And China was under attack for the way that it handled the early stages of the pandemic. But it also felt at the same time that its model had been validated by the way that the US and much of Europe had failed to halt the spread of the virus. And so the result was a series of outbursts by Chinese diplomats, apparently cheered on by Xi Jinping, who wrote actually a handwritten message to the foreign ministry calling for more fighting spirit from Chinese diplomats. And I think one diplomat above all, Zhao Lijian, one of the foreign ministry spokesmen, has become the face of this new style of diplomacy. He started off as a relatively obscure figure posted to China's embassy in Islamabad and rocketed to prominence when he picked a Twitter fight with former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. And he was eventually appointed foreign ministry spokesman, making him one of the most high-profile representatives of China across the entire government. Zhao has managed to anger pretty much everyone who's come across his path, but perhaps most spectacularly, he caused outrage in Trump's Oval Office when he suggested that the US Army had deliberately spread the coronavirus in Wuhan. And, Zhao is probably the best known of these figures, but he's not the only one. Another example is Gui Tongyo, the representative in Sweden, who was called to the Swedish Foreign Ministry 40 times in the space of 2 years. And when he was asked about his behavior in the media, he said, "For our friends, we have fine wine, and for our enemies, we have shotguns." And, I think it's important to say that not everyone in China's foreign policy establishment likes this new approach. Yuan Nansheng, who was China's former consul general in San Francisco, has warned about a trend towards extreme nationalism in Chinese foreign policy. And actually, even Xi Jinping himself, in the last couple of weeks, has talked about the need for China to present a more lovable image to the world, which I think is at least a modest acknowledgement that China, and especially Chinese diplomats, have become more frightening than lovable in recent years. But as we think about the chances for a reset or a recalibration, it's important to remember that anyone who's delved into the history of PRC diplomacy will know this fighting and combative spirit has been there right from the beginning. And with that, I'll hand it over to Susan for some discussion, and look forward to taking any questions.
Well, great, Peter. That was really interesting. And I haven't had a chance to read the book yet myself, but I'm certainly looking forward to that. So I'm wondering how you feel the diplomatic corps does in providing good information to decision makers in Beijing. One of the worries I have about this extreme pressure to show loyalty is that nobody wants to tell Xi Jinping or even his closest advisors, whoever they are, on foreign policy. That's another important question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But in terms of the information feedback loop, do you think they're providing accurate information about the backlash against Chinese actions, especially in recent days?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as you know, it's always been a problem in China's foreign affairs system, the ability to get accurate information to the leadership, which is not unlike US politics, but perhaps even more extremely is it spends its whole career focused on domestic issues and then is kind of thrust into the international limelight once they reach the Politburo or the Standing Committee level. So it's always been a problem, and I suspect the signs are that it's gone worse under Xi. The foreign ministry itself, I've spoken to diplomats both in the foreign ministry and in other ministries that do diplomacy, and they've talked about how because they know that this hard line is favored by the leadership, there's a fear of saying anything that looks too dovish, and so there's almost this kind of ratchet effect where if you're a junior person in a meeting or you're feeling a little bit insecure about your position, you want to be the most hawkish person in the room, and it's often actually left to the most senior officials to be the ones who kind of say, hold on a second, we shouldn't do this, it's not in our interest, because they feel more secure in their positions and they're able to do that. And so I'm sure that filters into the way that kind of information gets to the leadership. We've seen examples though of Kicker, which is a think tank that's affiliated with the Ministry of State Security, issued a report a couple of years ago saying that China was facing the biggest backlash in international opinion since Tiananmen. So there certainly are clear indications that some of that information is getting through. I do wonder, though, if it's being discounted too much by the leadership. I found China's response, for example, to the European sanctions over Xinjiang quite confusing. There's such a strong reaction and ended up having such a negative impact after China had spent 7 years negotiating the bilateral investment agreement with Europe, that I did kind of wonder if they were writing off opinion too much. But we'll see. We'll see how far Xi Jinping's new love warriors are successful.
Yes, and we'll see something when at the G7 meeting, which is coming up, and see how they hang together in their approach to China. So who do you think is actually advising Xi Jinping on foreign policy? Or do you feel that this Xi Jinping himself is making these decisions? There are a number of high-level foreign policy officials, right? We have, in particular, Yang Jiechi, who's the national security advisor, Wang Yi, the foreign minister and state counselor, and then Wang Huning is the person who travels with him. He's on the standing committee. He's kind of the propaganda guy and the speechwriter who's advised so many leaders of China. Fascinating figure. But which one of those do you think Xi Jinping actually listens to?
Yeah, I think first, with the usual proviso that Chinese leadership is a complete black box and all of us are just trying our best to guess at this, right? I would add a couple of names. I would on economic and trade issues, I would add Liu He, and on the Russia relationship, I would add Li Jianshu, who's Xi's special envoy to Russia and seems to have quite strong opinions on that relationship. It was very, very interesting to see the White House's Indo-Pacific coordinator, Kurt Campbell, recently say that Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi were, he said this publicly, were nowhere near, not within 100 miles of Xi's inner circle. He may well have much better sources than me. My understanding is actually that on US-China, Yang does get a seat at the table, and there are moments when that has been clear to foreign counterparts. Speak to some former Obama administration officials, it's quite clear that Xi does listen to Yang on those areas of his core competency. But I think, as with most areas of policy, Xi kind of positions himself in the center and will reach out for trusted aides as and when he needs them. But it's a kind of Xi-centric decision-making system.
Okay, so let's move to some of the questions from the audience. One question is whether or not you have any sense of how diplomats from other countries interact with Chinese diplomats, and what is their perspective on the Chinese diplomatic corps and the aggressive tactics recently.
Yeah, I think in some ways, smaller countries than the US felt the impact of Wolf Warrior diplomacy a little bit earlier. There is always this line, just despite Yang Jiechi's lecture in Anchorage to Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, there is always this degree of respect that the US affords simply because of the size of its economy and the strength of its military. And that respect is not automatically afforded countries like France, the United Kingdom, Australia, let alone smaller developing countries. And so some of those nations, Australia in particular, or South Korea in 2017, really saw the full wrath of China in a way that probably wouldn't be applied to the US. So they've seen it earlier and quicker. Some of the most revealing conversations I've had have actually been with diplomats from countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc. So when I started looking into these behaviors that Chinese diplomats display, I remember speaking to a Romanian diplomat and saying, they have a rule that they have to meet people in pairs. And he said, yeah, we know this well. I grew up with this system. Like, I see them moving around in pairs, and I see that, the Soviet Union's system of diplomacy. And so those have been some of the most kind of illuminating conversations, because you realize that in some ways, kind of Soviet civilization lives on in the party state apparatus of China.
One person wanted to know about China's influence growing in Latin America. And I'm wondering if you have some sense of the regional variations. Do you see a big push in Latin America, Africa, developing world, or Europe, or is the style of diplomacy vary by different regions?
I would say it varies less by region and more by occasion. So when Chinese diplomats are at an event where there's a good opportunity to talk about Chinese leadership or how China is upholding the international trading system or multilateralism, then the remarks can be, pretty conventional and, will kind of model Xi Jinping's Davos speech, right? It's all the talking points everyone would expect of a responsible stakeholder, to use Robert Zoellick's phrase. And then it seems like no matter what the geography, if the core interests of the Communist Party or the ruling legitimacy of the Communist Party are challenged in any way, the response in the last couple of years has tended to be very strong. So I think of, officials in Venezuela were told to shut up by Chinese diplomats during the virus when they blamed China for its origins. A senior Chinese diplomat in Brazil got into a Twitter fight with a member of Bolsonaro's family during that period. China's picked fights in the Pacific Islands, in Papua New Guinea. There was a very outspoken envoy in South Africa who he didn't criticize the local government as much as he criticized Trump, but he's still, was really quite strong-worded in Canada, in France, in Britain. So I think it's pretty widespread. It depends more, which playbook they've decided is more important for that day, right? Is it the charm offensive playbook or is it the assertive wolf warrior playbook?
So we have another question about the tweets, because the use of Twitter, which of course is not available in China, is one of the very noteworthy features of contemporary Chinese diplomacy, right? And one of our questioners, Sylvia Castillo, asks, the fellow behind the wolf metaphor tweets in Ireland seem to be very junior. And a lot of the tweeters on social media do seem to be quite junior. And so she asks, China is a pretty hierarchical system. Does that mean that these tweets have been explicitly approved, or are they junior people showing off for the MFA?
I think that is a crucial question, and one of the things that perplexes me most about the whole wolf warrior phenomenon, because Xi Jinping's whole political project seems to be about having the entire party state sing from one hymn book, his hymn book, and speaking clearly with a voice that is officially sanctioned from top to bottom, from province to province. And wolf warrior diplomacy, especially on Twitter, has often seemed to deviate from that. So Cui Tiankai, the ambassador in Washington, sounds very different to Zhao Lijin at the foreign ministry podium or on his Twitter account. And how do we reconcile those two things? My impression is that the general instruction to take a tougher, more assertive line came right from the top and was encouraged by Xi. I think we have a fair bit of evidence for that. I think a lot of the tactics in practice were improvised. So my understanding from my reporting of the most famous tweet of all, the one that alleged that the US Army had spread the virus, was that Zhao did not have permission from his superiors to tweet that, and that was something that he did on his own. Of course, like verifying any decision making within the Chinese government is very difficult, but that's my understanding of that incident. And I assume that quite a lot of the tweets kind of followed a similar vein. The message went out: we need to increase China's discourse power through Twitter, and we need to stand up for our interests, and we need to be more confident and assertive. And from there, these tactics started to be improvised. And I think sometimes that's happened in a way that the leadership really seems to like. So, you think of the Hua Chunying's promotion from deputy head of the information department to head. I think that's a pretty clear sign that her approach to talking at the podium went down well. But I think on other occasions, I don't think that the sometimes rather large consequences of individual tweets or postings were fully thought out.
Okay, so you think these folks are kind of political entrepreneurs trying to get noticed, and but the general direction. Say more about what you said about this handwritten note by Xi Jinping to the foreign ministry.
Yeah, so this was a piece of reporting done by Keith Jai, who was at Reuters. If you don't know Keith, I think he's like he would be like China's Maggie Haberman if there weren't so many restrictions on PRC nationals. But he was at Reuters at the time, and he's now at the Wall Street Journal, based out of Singapore. And he did some reporting which said that she had written this note to the foreign ministry, handwritten, and it said, I want you to display more fighting spirit in your diplomacy, and this was received. And when you put yourself in the position of a Chinese official who gets that note, it is a scary prospect. I would jump into line pretty quickly, I think, if I received that note. And that coming in the context of all of these speeches about what China's role is going to be in 2035 and 2050, and watching Xi talk to Jim Mattis about how China would never cede an inch of territory and China needed to win the international discourse struggle. And so all of the official messaging plus that very personal nudge, I think would be enough to create quite a powerful effect in the bureaucracy.
Sure. So Jeff Moon asks a good question here. He asks whether or not we see a similar spirit in other ministries, like the foreign ministry, especially in those that regulate foreign business activity. The NDRC, the Ministry of Commerce, other officials from other ministries that do deal with foreigners or may even be based overseas in embassies.
That's a great question. And hi, Jeff, by the way. I think not as much. So I think a few things are similar. The desire to make sure that messages which go out from the ministry are absolutely in line with Beijing. The political mood in Beijing is similar. But I think we haven't seen those kind of wolf warrior type displays from other ministries as much. If anything, and it's hard to generalize because ministries that carry out foreign policy are so varied in their roles. I would say overall the tendency seems to have been to keep quiet and avoid foreign engagements as much as possible. I know that across the bureaucracy, business people have found it harder to have informal conversations with Chinese officials. Journalists have certainly found it a lot harder. And so that, I think of NDRC early on in Xi's tenure, and there was sort of this halt in decision making and project approvals that happened. And so I would say to generalize a little bit too much, the trend across the rest of bureaucracy seems to be just to be ultra cautious and not to do too much.
So another person asks about non-state actors, especially media organizations, some of which are part of the Chinese government, some of which are private. How do the diplomats, do they coordinate with these non-state actors? And, do you feel that people in the United States and elsewhere understand how these media organizations are really operating on behalf of the Chinese government?
So that's a great question. And I suppose there are a few different pieces to answering that. One is non-state actors in the sense of research institutes and quasi-state actors and state-owned enterprises, which in the 2010-2012 period under the end of Hu Jintao's leadership, there was a big literature on foreign policy around China, which talked about how these organizations seem to be freelancing and creating foreign policy on their own and acting against the foreign ministry's interests. And there's that kind of stuff still happens. The Chinese government is very big, and there are lots of views across it, but there is much less talk of that kind of thing now. I don't think that's anything to do with the foreign ministry's power or influence. I think it's to do with the assertion of Xi Jinping's power over elite politics and the group consolidation of party influence across the government bureaucracy. So on that level, there's less talk of the influence of non-state or quasi-state actors. The next layer is kind of truly independent organizations, so civil society and that kind of thing. There was not much space to do that in China before Xi's tenure, and there's even less now. So, truly people-to-people exchange has become much more difficult, and that's because of factors in China to do with Xi's rule, and it's also to do with the policies of the last administration in the US. And I think the third piece, which the questioner spoke about, is the media piece. In general, there's much less space for, there was always like a narrow space for independent reporting. That has shrunk dramatically. On any foreign policy or sensitive political topic, most outlets will now carry Xinhua's copy, or will carry the People's Daily's copy instead of writing their own stories, because that's a safer thing to do. The one organization that I think has become really interesting to watch is the Global Times, and it's kind of a sign of the direction that Xi Jinping has taken foreign policy, because any of us who were watching in 2010, 2011, the Global Times was at times seemed to be pushing the government in a direction that was more nationalistic than the leadership was comfortable with, and was much more in line with online nationalists. And I think now on most days, it's quite difficult to see light between what the Global Times writes and what the foreign ministry says in public. And that's a huge shift. And I think it shows us how much China's foreign policy direction has changed in the space of the last decade.
So the foreign ministry moved closer to Global Times, not Global Times moving closer to the...
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, of course, one of the most important issues for Chinese officials is Taiwan. So one person asked, how did Chinese diplomats expect the next 5 years to play out with respect to Taiwan? So I'm wondering if you've had the opportunity to talk about the Taiwan issue with Chinese diplomats lately.
I would say that Chinese officials, so of all the topics where they have very little room to express personal opinion, Taiwan is probably the most sensitive. Perhaps behind the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule, Taiwan is the hardest thing for them to talk about. So it's quite difficult. I would say that Chinese diplomats in general tend to have a very passive role in China's Taiwan policy. That is something that's directed by the top leadership, and the full extent of Chinese diplomats' involvement is to rigorously uphold the opinions of top leaders like Xi, and not to freelance at all. There's always been incredible risk aversion when it comes to dealing with Taiwan if you're a Chinese diplomat. So there are some of the memoirs I looked at, there were occasions in the 90s and the 2000s when diplomats would get quite senior and they would write up these incidents as kind of the pinnacle of their professional careers, where that they would head to a trade fair in Papua New Guinea or something, and there'd be a Republic of China flag displayed in the wrong place, and suddenly it was a huge crisis for the embassy and all hands on deck, and we removed that flag and we made the motherland proud. And so they do stuff like that now, and actually they've done stuff like that for decades. And recently the most high profile example was a literal fist fight that took place in Fiji over a Taiwan flag displayed on a cake a reception. So I would tend to say that they don't talk much about what they think the outlook is, except to say that they will rigorously uphold China's policies.
Whatever they are.
Right.
Okay, and they have been consistent from, I'm sure they would also say that they haven't changed,
yes,
they haven't changed at all, and
right.
Yeah. So one of our first questioners asks about, how you think the Biden administration is doing in trying to influence Chinese policy and actions. How effective do you see them as being? Admittedly, it's early days, but do you see any signs of effectiveness, or what's your own hunch about that?
Yeah, so something that I've found really interesting in recent conversations, and I know that there are sort of friends and people I speak to who have had similar experiences, is this sense of, I think, genuine surprise that the Biden administration hasn't softened Trump's policies considerably.
Wait, from the Chinese side, they're surprised, or the American side, they're surprised? Okay.
Now, my response to that is like, you haven't been talking to enough people, because this stuff is deep-seated and it's bipartisan, So it struck me that they were surprised, because this, you would think, would be obvious, because when Hillary Clinton was preparing to set up a government in 2016 before she lost the election, it was very clear that the Democrats were also going to take a tougher line. That would have looked very different to Trump in terms of execution, but that consensus has been there for a while. Anyway, the surprise seems to be genuine, and the message that the administration wanted to deliver at Anchorage, which was that there was a new baseline for US-China relations, and there could be no return to the policies of 10 years ago, which Kurt Campbell recently characterized as engagement. That message was successfully delivered. I think that in terms of broader influence, it's too early to say what actual impact it's going to have on China. But there are two sets of things that I think the administration is trying to accomplish. So one is that they have correctly diagnosed that China believes that the US is a weakened power and that it's incapable of sorting out its own problems. And so the focus on infrastructure and technology and economic competition, Biden says it's aimed at China, and I think that's he's right that he will need to succeed on all of those fronts if China is going to adjust its foreign policies. The US will need to look strong at home. The second piece is that when I talked to officials before the election, the big thing that they found intimidating about the potential Biden administration was allies. And I think that managing, partly thanks to China's response to European sanctions, the US and the European Union are now working closely together on human rights in Xinjiang and perhaps also investment in economics. The Quad is a more coherent organization than it's ever been, also partly because of Beijing's policies. And I think that those changes, which are not really to do with the bilateral relationship, they're to do with the sort of confluence of forces around Beijing, probably will have some impact longer term if they're successful.
Okay. One question is about the Wolf Warrior movies and whether or not the Chinese government is promoting them and supporting them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the original movies were kind of a surprise commercial success. I don't think anyone involved in their production expected it to be the highest grossing Chinese movie ever. And the fact that it was allowed to get such considerable play, I think is a sign that on some level, people in the government liked the message and felt like it promoted something that they were able to get behind. I think the use of the wolf warrior terminology applied to Chinese diplomats and officials is not welcome and is not encouraged. The best statement on this was by Vice Foreign Minister Lo Yicheng in a speech last December, when he said that he felt the wolf warrior label was a discourse trap that the West had set in order to stop China fighting back. And what I think he means by that is it's okay for Western diplomats like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to insult other countries and to be very aggressive and assertive, but somehow it's not okay when China does it. You can argue with that characterization. I think actually the Trump administration and Pompeo was quite roundly criticized internationally, but anyway, that's the view in Beijing.
What about Taiwan's diplomacy? One questioner notes that Taiwan has, I wasn't aware of this term, cat diplomacy, that Taiwan has a kind of cat diplomacy. You'll have to explain that to me. Setting themselves up as a peaceful, democratic alternative to China's aggressive stance. Have you paid any attention to that, or have you heard any Chinese comment on it?
I have not, if I'm honest. I mean, I guess that's a perennial part of the way that Taiwanese governments have set themselves up in opposition to the PRC. But in terms of a sort of deliberate strategy, I would love to learn more about it.
Okay. And another question is about the level of training, education, knowledge, sophistication of Chinese diplomats. In other words, setting the ideological, political part aside, how well educated and well trained is China's diplomatic corps? How selective is the recruitment, and how how well educated are the diplomats?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would say the training and expertise is probably better now than it has been at any point in the PRC's history. That's especially true if you speak to people who deal with smaller languages, for example. It wouldn't have been the case that previous generations of Chinese diplomats could master languages of small countries in Europe, for instance, and now or Arabic in the Middle East. China has a group of very impressive Arabic speakers in its foreign ministry, and they have real depth of expertise on the region and amazing language skills. And there are a lot of study abroad programs that happen now. And so in terms of that formal part of the education, I think it's pretty good. There are obvious drawbacks that you would expect. So for example, the buddy rule, moving around in pairs, is something that under Xi Jinping has been quite strictly enforced for Chinese diplomats, even when they're studying abroad. So that sets obvious limits on the academic experience that they're going to have. But no, I think the training is pretty good. I think the place where the selection process falls short is more on the recruitment side. Since the 90s, the foreign ministry has had trouble competing with the foreign with the private sector for talent, and that continues to be the case today. And I think a lot of really smart young Chinese people are also put off by the idea that they can't go study abroad and come back and work in the foreign ministry, because that's something that makes them ideologically suspect.
So my colleague Barry Naughton has the final question here. He says, diplomats are professionally boring because their job is to represent the official viewpoint as closely as possible. In retrospect, how free do you think Chinese diplomats were to privately express more diverse viewpoints in the 1980s, 90s, or 2000s? Do you see some of that in the memoirs?
Yeah, so I think that, hi Barry, and that's absolutely right, that there's never been a huge amount of leeway for any official anywhere in the Chinese system. But, for instance, with the buddy rule, that the idea that they move around in pairs was quite imperfectly implemented in parts of the 90s and the 2000s. There were Chinese diplomats who would meet one-on-one with foreign counterparts for lunch. Cui Tiankai, for example, in Washington would sometimes do it. My understanding is that he hasn't done that in quite a long time. Some Chinese diplomats in the run-up to Tiananmen would talk about the motivations of the students in the square, or how they felt the party leadership was evaluating what was happening with the protests, and that stopped quite abruptly afterwards. And generally, those periods of openness have tended to coincide with the periods where Chinese diplomacy has been most impressive and most effective. And my kind of takeaway from reading all of these memoirs was that this is a group of people that's as smart and capable as anyone else out there, and really it's the strictures of the Chinese political system that stop them doing more.
Well, thanks so much for discussing so many of the questions. The questions were great this time, I thought. And we have a wonderful community of people who join us for our webinars, and we have another one next week on ethnic policy in Xinjiang. Here it is, by Tsering Topgill, who's a professor at University of Birmingham, who was our student at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's ethnic Tibetan and a very good scholar on PRC Tibet relations and policy. So he'll be talking about Tibet. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
It was, look forward to seeing you in person before too long, I hope. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Good afternoon.